Silence is not closure, it's camouflage. When someone stops speaking to you, stops calling, stops texting, stops showing up, it can feel like they've found peace, like they've made a clean break, and they're already moving on while you're still stuck in the wreckage. But that assumption is dangerous because silence, more often than not, isn't an indicator that someone has let go. It's often just their way of hiding what they don't want to deal with. It's a mask they wear so they don't have to feel vulnerable, exposed, or accountable for what happened between you. Closure is an internal process. It's the result of reflection, self-honesty, learning, growth. It takes confrontation with the self, with the truth, and sometimes with the other person. Most people don't do that work. Right? Most people don't look at themselves in the mirror and ask, what went wrong and what part did I play? So instead of healing, they go silent. It looks clean, but it's messy underneath. Silence gives the illusion that everything's settled. But just because someone isn't speaking doesn't mean the story is finished for them. Think about it. How many times have you been silent about something you couldn't let go of? How many times have you avoided someone not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much and didn't know how to express it? That's the thing. Silence can come from avoidance, not peace. It can come from being overwhelmed, not indifferent. It can come from fear, not strength. Sometimes silence is strategic. It's someone trying to regain control. They think, if I don't reach out, I don't risk being rejected. If I don't speak, I can pretend I've moved on. But emotional suppression isn't healing. It's deferral. It's hitting a snooze on your feelings. So they sit in silence, hoping time will do the work they're avoiding. But time doesn't heal what you won't face. It just delays the inevitable emotional reckoning. And for the person on the receiving end, you get caught in a psychological loop. You start wondering, was I that easy to forget? You tell yourself that silence means you didn't matter. That's the most dangerous part. Because in truth, their silence doesn't speak to your worth. It speaks to their emotional literacy, their ability or inability to deal with discomfort, honesty, or responsibility. So don't mistake silence for closure. Closure doesn't happen when someone disappears. It happens when you stop needing their words to move forward. When you start creating your own peace. When you stop interpreting their silence as a reflection of your value. Say, his silence might be loud, but your clarity needs to be louder. Emotional detachment isn't proof of healing. It's often just a performance, one that even the person doing it may not fully realize they're putting on. We live in a world that applauds a moving on as fast as possible. We associate emotional distance with strength, with maturity, with control. So when someone seems unfazed after a breakup, when they act cold, distant, or indifferent, it's tempting to believe they've healed, that they've processed it all and come out the other side fine. But healing and detachment are not the same thing. Healing is active. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. It requires you to sit in your emotions, to face the pain, to question your patterns, your choices, your attachments. Detachment, on the other hand, is often passive. It's an emotional shutdown, a numbing, a switch off. It's what people do when they don't feel safe or equipped to actually deal with what they're feeling. And sometimes they do it so convincingly that even they believe they're fine. But here's what most don't realize. Detachment can be a defense mechanism. It's how the mind and body protect themselves from feelings that are too heavy to carry all at once. Instead of grieving, they disengage. Instead of reflecting, they distract. Instead of communicating, they go silent. And because they're no longer emotionally reacting, people assume they've healed. But true healing isn't about how well you avoid the pain. It's about how well you walk through it. Sometimes the person who seems unaffected is simply compartmentalizing. They've boxed up the pain and shoved it into a corner of their mind where it can't be seen or felt. But it's still there, quietly shaping how they behave, how they connect, how they relate to others. That unprocessed pain leaks out in other areas. Commitment issues, emotional unavailability, anger, indifference, or even complete avoidance of intimacy. Just because they're not crying in public doesn't mean they're not bleeding in private. There's a difference between growth and escape. Growth looks like someone taking the time to understand the role they played in the relationship, owning their mistakes, forgiving themselves and the other person, and moving forward with intention. Escape looks like cutting ties, suppressing emotion, and throwing themselves into distractions, work, social life, dating, just to avoid sitting in stillness. So if he seems detached, don't assume he's over it. Don't assume he's stronger, wiser, or more emotionally evolved than you just because you're still feeling everything, and he's not showing anything. You might be the one who's actually doing the work. You might be the one who's truly healing, because you're not afraid to face the hard stuff. Emotional detachment might look like composure, but often it's just someone avoiding the mirror. Healing, on the other hand, requires you to look straight into it and ask, what now? That's the difference. And it's a difference that matters. Avoid mistaking the absence of communication for the absence of emotion. Just because someone isn't reaching out, just because you haven't received a call, a text, or a sign from them, doesn't mean they've stopped feeling. Silence isn't evidence of emotional emptiness. It's often just a veil. People have different ways of processing emotion, and not everyone does it out loud. Some people speak, some people shut down, some confront, others withdraw. But the absence of words isn't the absence of thoughts, memories, or emotional weight. Say go. We often assume that if someone truly cared, they'd say something, they'd show up, they'd check in, and in a perfect world with emotionally available, communicative people, that might be true. But in reality, many people care deeply and still say nothing. Not because they don't feel, but because they don't know how to act on those feelings. Because they're afraid of rejection, of being vulnerable, of saying the wrong thing, or of opening doors they're not ready to walk through. It's important to remember that emotions don't disappear just because they go unspoken. They linger, they brew, they show up in subtle, indirect ways, in their late nights scrolling through your social media, in the songs they can't listen to anymore, in the quiet way your name still stirs something in their chest. There's a lot happening behind the curtain of silence that you may never get to see, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. People often suppress communication because it's too risky. Once they speak, it makes the feelings real. Once they reach out, they're accountable for the consequences. And many aren't emotionally equipped to handle that. So they choose the safer route, saying nothing, not because they don't care, but because caring and acting on that care are two very different things. And here's where it gets complicated. When you're on the receiving end of that silence, your mind fills in the blanks. You assume they've forgotten, that they've moved on, that they never cared as much as you did. But what you're really seeing is not a lack of emotion. It's a lack of emotional expression. And those are not the same thing. When kids get the worst part, their silence often makes you question your reality. It makes you doubt your experience, your significance, your impact on their life. But don't let someone's inability to communicate rewrite your truth. Just because they're silent doesn't mean your connection wasn't real. Just because they haven't spoken doesn't mean they've stopped feeling. They've stopped feeling. And just because they're not showing it doesn't mean they don't think about you. So don't chase silence for answers. It will only echo your own confusion back to you. Trust what you knew. Trust what was shared when words were still flowing. And remember, feelings don't vanish with silence. They just get buried until someone is strong enough to face them. People grieve in private when they don't have the tools to grieve openly. It's easy to think that someone who goes quiet after a breakup just doesn't care. That they've shut the door and moved on without a second thought. But often, silence isn't a sign of indifference. It's a sign that they don't know how to process the loss. They don't have the language, the emotional safety, or the vulnerability to grieve in a way that others can see. Grief is not just about losing someone you love. It's about losing a version of your future you thought you'd have. And when that future disappears, people respond in very different ways. Some talk to their friends. Some cry, journal, seek therapy. They grieve outwardly. Others, though, lock it all inside. They don't talk, they don't cry, and they certainly don't reach out. Not because they don't feel pain, but because they've never learned how to safely express it. Many people grow up in environments where vulnerability is not encouraged. Maybe they were told to man up, get over it, or don't be dramatic. Maybe they watched the people around them hide their pain or pretend it didn't exist. So when heartbreak hits, their instinct to open up, it's to shut down. They internalize everything, thinking it's the strong thing to do. But grief that goes unspoken doesn't go away. It just turns inward. When someone grieves in private, it doesn't mean they're unaffected. It often means they're overwhelmed. They're battling memories, regrets, or what if est, an emotional confusion, without anyone to help them sort through it. They might replay conversations in their head, analyze every last moment, stalk your social media from a distance, and feel the weight of loss deeply. But from the outside, they look fine, detached, maybe even cold. That appearance, though, is just a shield. It takes emotional maturity to grieve openly. It requires vulnerability, accountability, and the ability to sit with discomfort. Not everyone has those tools, especially in moments of emotional crisis. So they isolate, they distract themselves with work, with socializing, with other people, anything that keeps them from confronting the pain directly. But that doesn't mean the grief isn't real. It just means it's hidden. And this is where we often get confused. We assume that if someone really missed us, we'd know, we'd see it. But just because someone is silent doesn't mean they're not hurting. They might not know how to reach out. They might be ashamed. They might feel guilt, fear, or pride. And sometimes they believe staying silent is the kindest thing they can do for you or for themselves. So don't confuse visibility with validity. Just because you don't see their grief doesn't mean it isn't there. People grieve in the ways they were taught, or not taught, to cope. And for many, that grief is done quietly, painfully, and alone. His silence might be strategic, not to hurt you, but to avoid confronting his own feelings. After a breakup, we tend to focus on what the other person isn't doing. He's not calling, not texting, not asking how you are. And naturally, you start to wonder, how could he stay so quiet if he ever truly cared? But what if that silence isn't about you at all? What if it's his defense against emotions he doesn't know how to deal with? For many people, especially men, vulnerability feels dangerous. They've been conditioned to associate emotion with weakness and pain with failure. So when they experience emotional discomfort, their first instinct is not to process it. It's to escape it. And one of the easiest ways to escape emotion is to avoid the source of it. You. If he reached out, if he talked to you, if he let himself feel what your presence triggers, he'd have to admit he's still affected. Silence is a form of control. It's a way to manage what feels unmanageable internally. We often assume silence is passive, that it's just someone choosing to do nothing. But sometimes silence is very intentional. It's a way to create emotional distance, not because the person has moved on, but because they haven't. He might be scared that hearing your voice would unravel him. That seeing you would bring all the emotions flooding back. That if he opens that door, he won't be able to shut it again. So instead of dealing with that uncertainty, he goes quiet. Not to punish you, but to protect himself. He may also be using silence as a way to gain back a sense of control. Breakups often leave both people feeling powerless. By withdrawing and staying silent, he gets to feel like he's in charge of the situation, even if only in his mind. He doesn't have to explain himself. He doesn't have to face your reaction. He gets to maintain the illusion of strength, even if it's just a mask. Another aspect of strategic silence is avoidance of responsibility. If he speaks to you, he may feel obligated to offer answers, apologies, or explanations he's not ready or willing to give. Silence becomes his way of sidestepping that emotional labor. It's easier to disappear than to deal with the emotional accountability that comes with being honest. And here's what's most painful. While his silence protects him, it leaves you spinning, wondering, questioning your worth. But it's important to remember, his silence says more about his emotional capacity than it does about your value. He might be trying to avoid pain, but in doing so, he's also avoiding growth. So don't mistake his quiet for clarity. Don't assume that because he's not reaching out, he's not affected. His silence might be his strategy to stay afloat, but you don't have to sink trying to interpret it. Let him avoid. You, on the other hand, get to confront, heal, and evolve. Silence can be a power play, not a peace treaty. When someone pulls away and goes completely quiet after a breakup or a conflict, it's tempting to interpret that silence as them taking space, seeking peace, or simply choosing maturity over drama. But not all silence is innocent. Sometimes silence isn't about healing, it's about control. It becomes a tool, a subtle way to shift the balance of emotional power without saying a word. In relationships and breakups, power dynamics are often invisible but deeply felt. When someone cuts off communication, they remove themselves from the emotional equation, forcing the other person to carry the weight of uncertainty. It creates a vacuum, one where you're left to fill in the blanks, analyze what went wrong, question what you said, and wonder if they're already over it. That silence pulls your focus inward, making you obsess over what you did or didn't do while they remain distant and unreachable. And that's where the power lies. When someone stops communicating, they remove your ability to respond. They take away the option for closure, discussion, or accountability. You can't argue with silence. You can't reason with it. You can't even fully understand it. And for some people, that ambiguity is exactly the point. It allows them to maintain emotional dominance without ever needing to engage directly. It's not about resolving anything. It's about leaving you off balance. In some cases, silence is used to punish. It's a way of saying, you don't get access to me anymore, without actually having to communicate that boundary. It feels cleaner than an argument, but the impact is just as sharp, if not worse. Because with silence, there's no confrontation, no moment to speak your truth. You're left in emotional limbo, and that confusion becomes its own kind of suffering. There's also a version of silence that feeds the ego. When someone stays quiet, they might secretly hope you'll reach out first, that you'll chase, apologize, or seek clarity. They position themselves as the one who doesn't need to engage, while you feel compelled to do all the emotional lifting. This creates an illusion of power, because in remaining silent, they seem unaffected, detached above it all. But often, that detachment is just a mask for emotional fear or immaturity. So when someone goes silent, don't automatically assume it's about peace. Sometimes it's about power, about withholding, about staying in control of the narrative while you're left without answers. And while you can't control their silence, you can control what you give your energy to. Don't waste your time trying to decode what someone won't say. Focus on what is being communicated, because even silence in its own way is a message. And often that message is this: I'm not ready to show up. So don't shrink yourself trying to fill in the gaps. Let silence say what it needs to, and then rise above the need to make it mean more than it does. Silence often signals emotional confusion, not closure. When someone cuts off communication, it's easy to assume they've come to some sort of internal resolution, that they've made peace with what happened and have moved on. But more often than not, silence is a reflection of inner chaos, not clarity. It's what people reach for when they don't know what they feel, how to process those feelings, or how to express them without making things worse. Emotional confusion is deeply uncomfortable. It can feel like being pulled in opposite directions at once. Part of them might miss you deeply, while another part feels overwhelmed, resentful, or afraid. Rather than face those conflicting emotions, rather than risk having to explain something they themselves don't fully understand, they choose silence. It feels safer, less messy, but it's not clean. In fact, it leaves just as much emotional residue, if not more. People who are emotionally confused often don't have the words for what they're experiencing. They feel everything, but they can't organize those feelings into coherent thoughts. So instead of speaking and possibly saying something they might regret, or something that reveals their vulnerability, they go quiet. It's not because they don't care. It's because they don't know what they feel clearly enough to share it. They don't know how to articulate the complexity. And so silence becomes their default. The irony is that this silence meant to protect them ends up doing damage to the very connection they're unsure about. While they sit in silence trying to sort themselves out, you're left feeling discarded, confused, and emotionally abandoned. You assume their silence means they don't feel what you feel. But in reality, it often means they don't know how to sit with what they feel, let alone communicate it. This is why it's so dangerous to take silence at face value. Because emotional confusion can look like indifference when it's really paralysis. They might want to reach out, but be afraid of opening up wounds they haven't healed from. They might think about you often, but stop themselves from acting on it because they don't trust their own judgment. Their silence isn't a sign of decisiveness. It's often a symptom of internal conflict. And here's the truth, clarity doesn't always come quickly. Some people need time, not just to get over you, but to even understand what you meant to them. That's not your fault. That's not your fault. And it's not your responsibility to wait around while someone else figures out how to process their emotions. So if he's gone silent, stop assuming it's because he's sure. More likely he's unsure, and unsure people often retreat rather than risk being seen in their vulnerability. His silence isn't your closure, it's his confusion. And you don't need to stay stuck in his emotional fog to find your own way forward. Just because he's not speaking doesn't mean he's not watching. Silence doesn't always mean absence, and distance doesn't always mean disinterest. In fact, in today's world, it's easier than ever for someone to stay connected to you without ever making their presence known. He might not. Social media, mutual friends, shared spaces, these become silent windows through which someone can still stay close, even while appearing distant. Some people watch from afar because they're not ready to engage directly. They're still emotionally attached, but they don't know what to say. Or maybe they do know what they want to say, but they're afraid of what your reaction might be. So instead of reaching out and risking rejection, awkwardness, or emotional vulnerability, they stay in the shadows. They check your posts, see who you're with, what you're doing, how you're coping. Every story, every photo, every caption becomes a way for them to stay connected without having to admit they still care. This silent monitoring is their way of staying close without feeling exposed. It gives them a sense of proximity without the vulnerability of conversation. And often, it satisfies just enough of their emotional longing to keep them from reaching out. They can tell themselves they're doing fine, that they've moved on, that they're just curious, but deep down, if they were truly done, they wouldn't feel the need to keep tabs on you. The very act of watching you, even quietly, is proof that something unresolved still lingers. But here's where it gets tricky. When you notice that he's watching, maybe he viewed your story, liked an old post, or keeps popping up through friends, it's easy to start reading into it. You begin to wonder, does he miss me? Does this mean something? And while it might, it's not always the message you think it is. Someone can miss you and still not be ready for you. They can think about you every day and still not be capable of showing up in the way you deserve. The truth is, watching from a distance is often easier than acting with intention. It's low risk. It doesn't require courage, effort, or accountability. So while it might feel good to know he still sees you, it doesn't necessarily mean he's doing the emotional work required to reconnect in a meaningful way. So don't let his silent presence confuse you. Watching you is not the same as fighting for you. Monitoring your life is not the same as being part of it. If he truly wanted to be in your world again, he'd do more than observe. He'd reach out, speak up, and take real steps toward reconnection. Until then, remember this, someone watching you from afar is still choosing distance. And you deserve someone who chooses closeness with clarity, not curiosity wrapped in silence. Sometimes silence is guilt in disguise. It's not that he doesn't want to talk, it's that he doesn't know how to face what he's done or how to carry the emotional weight of the hurt he caused. When someone knows they've played a part in your pain, speaking to you again can feel like standing in front of a mirror they're not ready to look into. And instead of accountability, they choose avoidance. Not because they don't care, but because facing you would mean facing themselves. Guilt has a way of silencing people. It creates an emotional paralysis. He might feel ashamed of how he treated you, of the way things ended, or even of what he didn't do, what he failed to give or say when it mattered. He knows that if he reaches out, he might be met with your truth, and your truth threatens the image he's trying to hold on to of himself. So he goes quiet. He convinces himself that staying away is better than risking confrontation, or worse, your disappointment. What's hard is that guilt-driven silence looks exactly like indifference. From your perspective, it seems like he doesn't care, like he walked away easily, like none of it meant anything to him. But in reality, he may be carrying a heavy emotional burden, one he simply doesn't know how to unpack with you. Silence for him becomes a shield against the discomfort of remorse. He tells himself that avoiding you is an act of mercy, when really it's self-protection. There's also the fear of not being forgiven. Reaching out might feel too risky if he believes he'll be met with anger or worse, emotional coldness. So instead of trying to make amends, he chooses distance. It feels safer to stay in the shadows than to step back into your world and be reminded of what he broke. His silence is not peace. It's a war he's having with himself, one he's too afraid to lose. But here's what you need to understand. Someone else's guilt is not your responsibility to carry. Our responsibility to carry. If he's silent because he can't face what he did, that silence is about his emotional limitations, not your worth. You're not responsible for making him feel better about the choices he made. And you certainly don't need to wait around for someone who only knows how to process guilt by disappearing. Guilt without growth is useless. If he's not willing to turn that guilt into reflection, conversation, or change, then it's just another form of emotional withdrawal. And no matter how much you want closure, you won't find it in the echo of someone else's shame. You find it in knowing that you showed up with honesty and heart, and that his silence says more about his inability to face that than it does about anything you did wrong. Sometimes silence isn't about ignoring you. It's about protecting himself from pain he can't handle right now. When a relationship ends or faces turmoil, the emotional aftermath can feel overwhelming. Some people respond by shutting down completely, retreating into silence as a way to shield their heart from further hurt. It's not that he doesn't care anymore. It's that the pain of confronting those feelings feels too intense or confusing. Emotional pain can be incredibly difficult to process. It can make a person feel vulnerable, exposed, and uncertain about how to move forward. Instead of facing those feelings head-on, some choose silence as a coping mechanism, a way to avoid the rawness of grief, rejection, or loss. This kind of silence is less about you and more about his own limitations in handling emotional distress. By retreating into silence, he may be trying to protect himself from emotional overwhelm. He might feel that opening up, explaining, or even just acknowledging the situation would break the fragile emotional balance he's trying to maintain. So, in his mind, silence becomes a defense. It's a way to put up walls and hold the pieces of himself together until he feels strong enough to deal with the pain. This self-protective silence can also stem from fear of vulnerability, fear of judgment, or fear of rejection. Sometimes the thought of sharing what's inside feels too risky. What if he reaches out and the response isn't what he hoped for? What if the conversation makes everything worse? Choosing silence becomes a safer option than risking further emotional damage. But this silence doesn't mean he's indifferent or that his feelings have disappeared. In fact, the opposite is often true. The more intense the pain, the harder it can be to express. Some people aren't taught or don't know how to navigate emotional pain in healthy ways. So rather than reaching out, they pull away. Their silence is a sign of their struggle, not their lack of feeling. It's important to understand that this kind of silence isn't about punishing you or showing you that he's over it. It's about him trying to survive his own emotional storm. While this might make things confusing or painful for you, it's a reflection of his internal process. And that process can take time, sometimes much longer than we expect. The challenge is that when someone is silent for self-protection, it can feel like an emotional dead end for you. You're left waiting, wondering, hoping for signs of connection that may never come. This is why it's crucial to protect your own emotional well-being. Recognize that his silence is not a reflection of your worth or desirability, but a signal of his current inability to cope. Ultimately, his silence is his way of trying to heal, even if it feels like abandonment to you. And while you can't force him to open up, you can choose to honor your own healing journey. Protect your heart by accepting that sometimes the silence isn't about you. It's about the pain he's not ready to face yet. Sometimes his silence is less about the past and more about his own need to grow. When a relationship ends, especially if it was significant, the process of moving forward isn't just about forgetting or moving on. It's about evolving as a person. For some men, silence is a space they create for themselves to figure out who they are outside of the relationship, to understand their own mistakes and to become a better version of themselves before they re-enter the emotional world again. Growth requires reflection, and reflection requires space. When he steps back and goes silent, it can be because he recognizes that he needs time alone to process his experiences and emotions deeply. This isn't about avoiding you. It's about turning inward, confronting his own patterns, and taking responsibility for his part in what happened. It's a private journey that requires patience and courage, and sometimes the best way he knows to do this is by withdrawing. In silence, he might be wrestling with questions like, what did I learn from this relationship? What did I contribute to the problems? How can I grow from this experience? These questions don't have easy answers, and the process can be uncomfortable and slow. But it's essential if he wants to avoid repeating the same mistakes and to show up differently in the future. This period of silence is a form of emotional homework. It's where he's trying to build emotional resilience, develop self-awareness, and sometimes even redefine what he wants from love and relationships. It's not about shutting you out permanently, but about creating a healthier foundation for whatever comes next, whether that's reconciliation, friendship, or simply moving on with greater clarity. It's important to remember that growth is not linear. He might seem distant, inconsistent, or even confused during this time. He may reach out one day and retreat the next. That's part of the messy process of change. Silence can be frustrating and painful to endure on your end, but it often signals that he's doing important internal work that you can't see. At the same time, his silence shouldn't be an excuse for you to wait indefinitely or lose your own momentum. His growth journey is his responsibility, not yours. You deserve to live your life fully, to heal, and to grow yourself, regardless of where he is in his process. When he eventually breaks the silence, if he's truly committed to growth, he will come back with more emotional availability, maturity, and understanding. Or he may choose a different path altogether, one that reflects the changes he's made inside. Either way, the silence is a sign that he's trying to become a better version of himself, not necessarily that he's forgotten you. So instead of trying to interpret every quiet moment, give him the space to grow while you continue to honor your own growth. Embrace your worth, honor your growth, and keep your heart open for the connections that bring you the respect and love you truly deserve. That's how you move from silence to strength, and that's how you reclaim your life.